Andy Warhol said everyone would be famous for 15 minutes. Well, you'll be pleased to know it's not going to take 15 minutes for me to tell you just how good this docuseries is.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, action.
Andy Warhol's greatest work of art is Andy Warhol.
Everyone these days is an icon. You make a good movie, you're a film icon. You go on TV for 2 series, you're a television icon. You send a good tweet, it gets retweeted 1,000 times, you're a social media icon. You win pop icon, and you're an icon. But Andy Warhol, he really was an icon.
Andy was creating contemporary culture.
I am Warhol. No one's more famous in the 20th century than Andy Warhol. Andy.
But I don't think you'll ever figure Warhol out, and I hope no one ever does.
Andy Warhol had a profound effect on 20th century pop culture through his art, through his music, and through the things he said and did. And I'm sure that's why Ryan Murphy, he behind things like American Crime Story, jumped at the chance to make a docuseries about such an iconic figure. Produced by Murphy and directed by acclaimed filmmaker Andrew Rossi, these are a series of films that are designed to get you under the skin of Andy Warhol, to understand the artist and not just the art. We're all familiar with the pop art and the Campbell's Soup and Studio 54, but how much do we actually know about what made Andy Warhol tick? What he was as a man, what he was in private.
Was Andy out? Well, he was never in, so...
Using found footage and recreations, as well as interviews with people who knew Warhol intimately, as well as famous people whose lives have been influenced by Warhol and his works, at the centre of this series of films are the diaries of Andy Warhol. Now, for 20 years, between 1967 and 1987, Warhol would at 9 AM each day phone his friend Pat Hackett, and he would record everything that he said. These conversations began actually as a way of Warhol trying to record his expenses for taxation purposes, but actually as time went on and as we start to see, it actually became a way of Warhol letting out a lot of his inner feelings, talking about things he'd done, talking about things he felt, and actually revealing a lot of his inner self to Hackett. A couple of years after the death of Warhol in 1987, Hackett released these diaries as a book, and they remain at the centre of this whole story. Now, in most documentaries, you'd expect that the diary would be read aloud by an actor here and there to hold together the show and give some context. That's not quite the case here, because in fact those excerpts are read by Andy Warhol himself. Well, a version of him, an AI-generated version of Andy Warhol narrates this story, which is quite strange.
I'm just a freak. I wasn't very close to anyone. Although, I guess I wanted to be.
However, as Warhol had gone on record in his life saying, "I want to be a machine," perhaps this is a fittingly quirky way to deliver the narrative of the story. This is ultimately the story of a hugely creative force, and as with so many of the best and the greatest creatives in the world, this is also someone who was vulnerable, someone who was lonely, someone who at times found it very difficult to cope with all that was around them. Uncomfortable in his own skin, grappling to define and exhibit his sexuality, and not understanding his place in the world and in the environment with which he operates. This is the portrait of a man who is brilliant, but also flawed.
If you want to know anything about my work, look behind it, there's nothing there, is really just not true. Within the diaries, there are these clues that he did have these intimate relationships.
Andy was in love with Basquiat. I don't know if it was sexual, but there was a relationship there.
He broke every rule. He made you look at things in a completely different way, but that's what art is.
We hear from many famous faces in this documentary, from Jerry Hall, from Debbie Harry, from Rob Lowe, from people who have been influenced by Warhol, from people who have met him and have spent time with him. This is all interwoven around this eerie AI narration from a version of Warhol himself, which makes you feel very much like you are there with him in the room. There's also archive footage which shows you Warhol making his art, going about his business. This is a complex piece of documentary making that brings together lots of different factors, and it just works. It works brilliantly. If you're interested in Andy Warhol, his art and his legacy, this is a must-watch for you. If, however, you are just interested in the way that 20th century pop culture has changed things, how celebrity has become what it is today, then this is also something that you should watch, because Andy Warhol's legacy is one that is still with us, and this is a fascinating piece of filmmaking which highlights that and the man that was behind that legacy. Thanks for watching. I told you it wouldn't take 15 minutes. If you like the video, please show your appreciation and hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to Screen OD. Leave in the comments below what you think of the documentary, and we will see you again very soon.